So I'm going to speak for, I don't know, 15 minutes, and then we can just have a conversation back and forth about things that are raised by what I say and what questions you might have. I'm a sociologist by training, so when I talk about social science research, just be aware that there are some differences across the disciplines. I can give you an accurate picture of what good research is like in sociology. It's not totally dissimilar to, say, political science or economics, but there are some differences to be aware of. So for sociology, the most important thing is that research be theoretically motivated. And what we mean by that is that there ought to be some discussion in the beginning of any paper about what theory is involved or theories are involved in what they're trying to do. So the theories are needed because you need to have an idea about what is happening in the phenomena you're studying. Right? So if you're studying voting behavior, there are a number of theories of the way voters decide how to vote. And if you were going to do a study of voting behavior, it's not sufficient to simply say, we're just going to count how many votes there were. That's not very interesting. I mean, if you're the politician, it's interesting. But from a science point of view, it's more about why did the vote turn out the way it did? Why do people make certain choices that they make in the voting booth? What influences them? And for that, you need a theory or theories which would describe the underlying process whereby people make decisions like voting. What are the factors that influence? So with a theory in hand, then you can start about deciding, okay, what things am I going to need to collect data on in order to evaluate the theory, in order to see if that theory is useful in understanding the voting phenomenon we have going on. And actually, it's ironic that about 50 feet away over there, there's a guy named James Jackson from the University of Michigan who's one of the foremost, he's giving a talk today in psychology, one of the foremost experts in the country on voting behavior. He's at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, which founded the study of voting in the United States. So I use that, that's why I use that as an example here to start out, because he's giving a talk literally right now in psych. Or he just finished, I guess, 3:30 to 5. They're trying to hire him, so maybe you could take a course from him if you're going to be around for a while. The second element that's of any good piece of research, and this is generally true across the social sciences, is the quality of the data. What are the measures? How are they operationalized? Operationalization is the task of taking your theoretical concepts and defining them as something that can actually be gathered on or to be measured. So if you say voting behavior, that's a pretty easy operationalization. How did you vote in the last election, right? But some concepts are a little trickier. If you say self-esteem is one of the things that influences voting, how would you measure self-esteem? Well, it's not obvious how self-esteem would be measured. It turns out there's a lot of research on this, and there are many scales, indexes that have been proposed to measure self-esteem by various authorities that have been tested and tried in a lot of populations. So that's the kind of thing you would need to do next, is to figure out, once you have the concepts outlined from the theory, how are you going to operationalize them? And then third, the quality of the actual data collection. Right? So you could have very well-defined concepts, you have a great theory, you have operationalization nailed, but you do a lousy job of collecting the data. So, and what would be a lousy job? Well, not effectively talking to the subjects, not gathering subjects properly. That's more in the realm of sampling, right? Which is a whole other topic. But let's say the you're doing an internet survey and your distribution, whatever mechanism you're using, distribution doesn't work very well. So that would be a problem of data collection. You want to talk to students by standing at a corner at the hub on an afternoon, but you pick a rainy afternoon and there are no students out there except you under your umbrella, trying to find students to talk to. Just you could have bad luck like that. Obviously, if it's raining the day you were going to do that kind of data collection, choose another day, postpone. Right? Let's say you were going to have people call in to a phone number, and you find out halfway through that the phone number is not working. So there's a variety of ways to which your data collection can break down, and that has to be looked at carefully in any report, how the data was actually collected. Now, a lot of things you're going to see, because of the limits of resources, are going to be what we call convenience samples. And that's not necessarily bad. It does limit the generalizability, and any report on such a sample, for example, the standing on the corner next to the coffee shop in the hub and grabbing people who go by is what we call a convenience sample, right? It's not selected by any probabilistic means. That would be a good sample. Any sample that has a selection based on probability. So, for example, if you got a list of all the students, say all the sophomores at UCR, and you selected every third one or every second one after you flipped a coin to decide whether it's the first one or the second one you started with, that would be a sufficiently randomized sample to be a good sample. That even something that simple. If you put the whole list into a computer and asked it to give you a selection of 100 at random using a random number generator, that would be even a better sample. But most of your samples you're going to be looking at are not going to be like that because students don't have the resources to do that. So it's going to be a convenient sample. As I say, that's not necessarily bad, but it means that somewhere in the report it needs to be acknowledged that while these findings may be interesting and provocative, if they are, they cannot be generalized to larger populations, even of UCR students, because the sampling method undermines that generalization. So that's okay as long as you acknowledge it. If you try to take a convenient sample and say it truly represents all of UCR students and you can make broad conclusions, then that's not a good paper, right? Because you can't do that. Next is data analysis. And this is going to vary a lot as well because this involves mainly statistics. I'll talk in a minute about things that don't involve statistics. But for right now, let's keep this train of thought going that I've been describing. So statistical analysis can be complicated. So depending on the author's training in statistics, they may or may not be able to do something very complicated. So basically what you're mostly going to be looking at is what we call measures of association. There are a whole lot of them, so don't be taken aback if it says they used Trubskow's T. That's a perfectly valid measure of association under certain assumptions. Kramer's P, there's just a million of them. The basic one is called the correlation coefficient, right, or Pearson's R. That can be used if you have continuous data, like a scale of 1 to 100. But if you just have categorical data, like yes, no, or good, bad, and ugly, then some of the other more obscure ones are likely to be used. Kramer, there's a V, there's a K, there's, like I said, T. There's also a basic measure of association called chi-square, which you'll see a fair amount. Chi-square is when you have like a table of, Democrats or Republicans, favor trade, don't favor trade. That would be a 2x2 table. Chi-square test can tell you whether or not there's an association between those two questions, right? Whether there's a pattern that's different from random. And that's what most of these statistics are going to be telling you. Is there something interesting in the data that's not just a random assortment of numbers, right? So that's called an association. And that's a lot of what you're going to be looking at, is association tests. And they're perfectly fine, and you can do a lot with them. You can address hypotheses like, is there an association between political party membership and your attitude on trade? It'd be a perfectly valid kind of research project. It's backed up with theoretical analysis, and the data collection is decent, and we use a chi-square to say, well, yes, it turns out that there is an association. And then you look at the table, and you can see if there's an association. If it's not, the random table would be if you had 80 respondents, right? 20 in each cell would be totally random. No, there's no association. If you go this way across the table, it's the same as you go this way. So there's no connection between the two variables. On the other hand, if Democrats are more likely to favor trade than Republicans, well, then you've got an association, right? And the meaning of it depends on that theory that you outlined in the beginning, and then you can conclude going forward. So those are the basic kind of elements. There is a whole style of social science research that is not quantitative, that doesn't involve things like questions and surveys and numbers and association tests. This is generally referred to as qualitative research. Now, qualitative research is very, very valid, very useful kind of research. Sometimes certain questions can really only be gotten at by asking people detailed questions, instead of your basic kind of survey thing where you can ask a quick question and get an answer. Usually, qualitative work either involves observation. So a classic piece of observation could be, how do students behave on the hub patio? You'd have to be more specific about a certain kind of behavior. I mean, what's the gender interaction pattern that you see in the tables outside at the hub? But you could do that by observing the pattern you see without actually counting things, without making it quantitative. But just observing for several hours over several days and seeing what patterns you see is developed. You can also ask the subjects. That requires, of course, and anytime you're asking subjects, and by the way, I should have said something about this earlier. Anytime you're asking people questions, whether it's quantitative answered questions or qualitative, you have to look at the human subjects protection stuff, and that should be reported in the paper as to what they did to protect the identity of the subjects and to protect any confidential information that they might have asked. That should be described. Okay? And of course, to do research legitimately, they will have had to have gone through the Human Subjects Protection Board on campus to get it approved. But that needs to be acknowledged in the paper somewhere. You need to know that, because otherwise it would be illegal to publish that research. So, how do you feel about if your object is to find out details about why people oppose free trade agreements, for example? That's not really a question you can ask or get much detail in a survey sort of fixed choice answer question. There are many reasons why people might oppose free trade agreements. If you started trying to list them in a question, choose one of the following, you might have 22 choices. That's a bad question. Too many choices, too complicated. The subjects would likely to be fatigued or not answer. So that's the kind of a study where, let's say you had 5 people that agreed to be interviewed, and you spent an hour talking to each one of them about their attitude towards free trade agreements. And you might get at things like, well, my grandfather lost his job when the NAFTA trade thing got passed, and my family's always been very upset about this because he got screwed over in favor of more trade with Mexico, and is this really a great idea for our country? And, you might get a lot of affect and detail about something like that you wouldn't get from any question. So a perfectly good study would be interviewing 5 people, even though it's not a large study, it's not representative, but you get the nuances and the richness of the responses that are part of the research objective. So that's a perfectly good social science research project as well. It looks different in the report. You would expect to see a lot of quotes from the subjects. You would expect to see the author weave a common story across the 5 subjects, if they could find one, or simply assert that everyone seems to have their own different views. There's no communality. That would be a very surprising finding. Unlikely, because people have communalities. That's one of the reasons you can do social science research, because people have communalities in their behavior and their understanding of it. Okay? So you can use scientific methods to ascertain those things. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Ask me questions.
Do you want to pull up
Yeah, I have it on my email account. You sent that out to everyone, right?
the... Yeah, it's on the island actually.
These are the 2 examples.
Yeah, 2 example ones. So if for those of you that read it, because I know we kind of posted it a little late. For those of you that have read it already, any of you have any questions on whether it's good or it's bad, or what specific questions you have for Dr. Parker while we're pulling it up?
I have a question for you, Dr. Parker.
Yes.
Because we're a multidisciplinary journal,
Right.
we don't get super technical, jargon-heavy research.
Right.
Because generally people tend to send those to specific journals.
Right.
So with that in mind, is there a way that we should be looking at them with, that knowledge known? You know what I mean? It's not, they're scientific, but they're not, very heavily scientific. So, is it different? What makes a good paper and what makes a bad paper? Is that different because they're not as, jargon heavy and whatnot?
I don't
Does that
think
make
so.
sense?
No, I know what your question is. I don't think so. I mean, I think there's still basic forms and basic expectations that you would have about any piece of reporting on a research project that you would like to see, And, the jargon stuff, I mean, jargon is sometimes necessary, but it's never really good, I think. The people who are most successful in sociology, for example, they write in ordinary language. They explain the jargon in a way that everyone from different, because sociology is a very diverse field, right? And so we almost have the same problem in sociology that you do in an interdisciplinary, because we're almost too complicated for just one discipline, the way the divergence of ideas and approaches is. So people who do the best, whose work is most well received, write in a way to either be able to define the jargon clearly or to explicate it so that everybody really understands it as normal kind of language that's accessible to everyone. Because otherwise it's just too specialized. There are some journals that are very specialized and they're pretty heavy jargon laid, but the general journals, we have a tradition in sociology of having 3 major general journals, and you will get rejected at those journals with a great piece of research that's too specialized and too jargony.
Interesting.
There's this idea of what the general reader would be interested in, who's a sociologist of any stripe. And the closer you can get to that sort of larger audience appeal, the better off you do in those journals. We were just reading about one of the founders of one of those journals today. It's called the American Journal of Sociology, and it's published by the University of Chicago.
And that very similar runs with our journal, in the sense that we publish anything that sort of has to be honors caliber. We used to say honor students only, but now as long as you have the caliber and honor student, which also means that our journal should be readable by anyone who's an honors caliber student, which usually we define as a higher 3.0, or someone who represents.
Talking 44 caliber,
yeah, right.
50 caliber.
Yeah. Your crime background is getting a little too bled into this, but that's sort of the point too. And Ashley made a very good point: is that we don't want something that's too jargon heavy, but at the same time, sometimes it's necessary, but it has to be explained and accessible to people outside of your own field. I know I have this sort of problem when I've read like political science papers that I think they're amazing, but then other people read them, and Beck Corbin actually had this problem last year. He didn't understand half of it because it wasn't explained well and it was all used in jargon, and it was actually a terrible paper, but I enjoyed it. So you have to sometimes distance yourself from what your own field of study is.
I think that's an interesting point that you made, though, that like it's almost better if they're not super jargon heavy and whatnot. Because I know that I've been worried in the past that like we won't get very scientific submissions, because generally those kind of submissions are, you know, they take however long to put together the research, so they're going to send them to a journal that like specializes in that. But we're almost better off, I think, in that sense, because we don't want super jargon
Right.
heavy. So my fear of not getting those super science
I think
research is not necessarily
Yeah,
a problem.
yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. Given the goal of the journal,
Right.
Yeah.
To be readable and
and
whatnot.
to be interdisciplinary.
Well,
Other questions?
Do you have any impressions on the two examples? Well, we have one of them up right now.
Yeah, I thought this one was reasonably
oh, sorry, I was gonna pull up the other one too.
reasonably good. The first one, I mean, it uses the measures of association that I was talking about to do its analysis. If you skip down to that part,
I know, so do I. This was last year, one of the last year.
Yeah.
It's a weird way to look at it.
You hit enable editing,
Let me scroll.
yeah. Put it back into a normal Word doc.
so this follows kind of that form that I was talking about, where it talks about the ideas behind it, and then you get to the method, the review of the literature, of course, and they've got these variables where they tell you how they operationalize these things in these scales. And then there's, stop right there. See, they're giving you, first of all, they're giving you what we call univariate statistics, means, standard deviations, give you an idea of the distribution of the variables, and then they're using Pearson product moment correlations to show the associations. And I was just going to say, those correlations generally vary between 0 and 1, and they can be negative to show that if one variable goes up, the other goes down. If they're positive, then it means as one goes up, the other goes up.
Were there any problems with this piece? I mean, they may not be like big problems where you'd automatically throw it out, but anything that you think we should look out for, or on both pieces, in fact?
Yeah, I thought they were, the other one was a little more along in the qualitative line that I was talking about. So, there's a legal research kind of aspect here to this one. And again, that's going to look a little different than, say, where you interview subjects. They're analyzing structures of government and client-server download processes and so on.
So these would be good examples of like each version.
I think so, yeah. This one is a little more specialized because of the fact that they're not actually. I mean, it's true that they end up in a survey, and the survey maybe was not described as well as it could have been. But it's a convenient sample, as I indicated before, and that's, you're going to see a lot of that because it's just the resources it takes to have a full representative sample of, say, all the students on campus. It's going to be prohibitive for most student researchers.
So what's a good way for those of us that are not super sciencey like myself to read these without going into it like, this is a science paper and I know I'm gonna hate it. You know what I mean? Like, that was my problem I think last year with the research, is just because like there's lots of this kind of stuff that I don't necessarily understand easily. And it's kind of dry, at times.
The thing is, there's a burden on the writer to make it understandable. And if if your lack of understanding is because you don't engage it, okay, that's your problem. But if your lack of understanding is because they don't explain it well,
Then you have a problem.
then that's a weak paper. You have a problem.
So how does a paper like this protect its sample population? Because like they are dealing with like illegal things here, like piracy. So like,
Right.
how would they protect? Like, what's a good way to protect it?
Well, a good way to protect it would be never to ask their names. Right? So that's called an anonymous survey.
Mhm.
Right? So if you never collect their name with the data you're collecting, then there's no way to trace. Like if somebody got a hold of these data, an authority, and wanted to find out who said this. That they pirated this and that. If
Right.
there's never any link, any document that links the people's names to their data, then it's impossible to do that. And that's what you want to do in a case like this, is make sure that there's no way. Normally, you wouldn't need to ask their names in a case like this. The only reason to ask names, okay, and only that one copy of the list links the names to the numbers. And then you can use that to do the second wave, but once that's done, then you destroy that master list so that there's no way to link people to the numbers.
And in an overwhelming number of pieces we get that have these sort of methods, they already have this stuff approved by their campus. Like the research I do involves surveys, some of them from political figures, I don't even for all of them, but some of them are from private citizens, so I have to get IRB approval in order for me to actually even do that at all, which many of if they've conducted any sort of research like this, they usually have it, and we confirm that.
I don't know what your call looks like, your call for papers, but it ought to mention something about that you want to see information in the report that's submitted about human subjects protection. If it's not there, you should ask for it.
Is it required that they submit IRB approval?
To you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, I'd like to see it in every article, not just an approval that goes to the editors, but I don't know, maybe that's sufficient. But to me, it would be good to see it in print, in the final article. So.
Keep in mind.
Any other final questions? Because I know you have to get up to Penn.
I was just wondering regarding the survey, because generally the surveys are, the people that do the surveys are the ones that they want to do it. So there's some sort of bias there, and then I kind of never really understood how they control that if they're doing like that sort of survey.
Well, there's no way to control for it except through sampling. Right? If you can do a probabilistic sample, then there's no bias because you select people based on a probability sample to represent a population. Okay? Now, if a person refuses, then you select another member of the same population with the same probabilistic formula. So that, again, overcomes the bias, right? Because everyone you select with a known probability from an underlying defined population. Okay? Now, short of that, there is going to be bias, right? There's just no way to deal with it. It's just a fact of these kinds of data collections. And so what you hope is interesting is that, yes, it's acknowledged that the sample is not representative, but the results are interesting. One of the things that I did in my senior thesis, I was doing a sample of students on campus, right? And the students, of course, didn't respond. Every student didn't respond that I asked. Right? And I had no way of making them respond, and I didn't have a probability sample. But what I did was I used a questionnaire that had been used on a national representative sample of the U.S. And then I was able to compare my results on certain questions to the national sample. So that gave me an idea of how much bias there was and in what direction. So that's a way to handle that question in a very, I immodestly say, a sophisticated way for an undergraduate paper. Because then you acknowledge the fact that your sample is going to be biased, but you compare it to a non-biased sample and get some idea of what the differences are. And what I found in the main questions I was interested in, that the student sample was pretty similar in its distributions to the national sample. So that gave me confidence that I could make reasonable generalizations. Okay. But if you want to deal with that, you're going to have to do something like that. Use, say, a national surveys questionnaire for your own survey, and then you're able to compare the results. So that the stocking survey, the stocking paper could have done that because they were looking at the National Victim Survey, NCRS, NCVS, National Crime Victim Survey. I don't think they did that, but they could have.
Anything else? Okay, and since this is one of the last times I can say it, ladies and gentlemen, again, Dr. Barker, thank you.